Gentleman from Michigan, the chairman of the committee, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a significant hearing, and I just wanted to thank Judge Gomer for his concerned observations that grow out of his experience. Very important here today. We're going to have a hearing and a markup on the Youth Promise Act. And I think these things go together with things that are happening right around us. You see, last night we were at the White House where the Hate Crimes Act was signed into law. I think Chairman Cohen was there, weren't you? Well, that was another event. Okay, you weren't there. But Zoe Lofgren was there, and there were others on the committee that were there. And the Hate Crimes Act started under President Bill Clinton. Well, how do you know that? Well, because I was invited to the White House when Clinton was president, where he called in the Southern governors because there was a rash of cross burnings, mostly throughout the South, not entirely. And he said, this has got to end. We've been treating these as arson cases. And from now on, we're not. We're going to treat them as a hate crime. It's more than just burning something down. This is not. This is an act of violence motivated to intimidate people. And you could have heard a pin drop. And shortly thereafter, I introduced the Hate Crimes Act. And it's grown over the years till yesterday at 4:30 p.m., the 44th President of the United States signed another extension of hate crimes, extending it into sex and gender and choice violations would now be criminalized. That is, enhanced penalties would be put onto whatever the basic crime was because of hate crimes. I'm sitting in front of a former criminal defense lawyer of many years. What Steve Cohen has done in his state of Tennessee as a legislator for a couple decades before he ever came to the Congress has a great deal to do with what propels him to want a comment before we start this hearing. And all I want to do, Chairman Scott and Judge Gomer, is to indicate to you that we're dealing with a historical problem. It's not, and sure, we had a problem before we got into this disparate sentencing. We come out of a history that now has international significance because of things we are doing and not doing in terms of the violence and the oppression and the economic hardships that we make whole people face, the genocides that go on. All this is not unconnected. Only a few days ago, the courts in Texas determined that a young person should be executed even if there was no direct evidence that his life should be. This is in the 21st century, after libraries of examination of social circumstances, crime and punishment, how to build a just society. We just executed a person, a young person, who there was no, we are still taking lives of people when there is no connection, no evidence that the prosecutor could produce to determine that he was guilty. We not only sanctioned that he would be found guilty, but he would give up his life in addition. And so this whole thing brings us to the sentencing project and cure, and the people that have followed the great work of this committee. The only thing I want to be of assistance on with my close friend Judge Gomer is his thoughts about the Congressional Black Caucus. Now, I was not only a founding member of the Black Caucus, I was one of the 3 people that said that there ought to be a Black Caucus for us to found. And it is true that we had, and I'm trying to get back, Judge Gomer, associate membership in the Congressional Black Caucus so that race and color and previous dispositions will not be any bar. But I want to be the first to assure you that the Congressional Black Caucus has never advocated or supported or endorsed the disparate sentences that we've been trying to eliminate between crack, powder, and cocaine. Never. Well, how do you know that, Chairman Conyers? Because I was the first African American in the history of this country to ever serve on the Judiciary Committee. And I was once the chairman of the Crime Subcommittee. And I follow these matters very closely, even before there was a Congressional Black Caucus. And I just want...
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
With pleasure.
Has the gentleman seen the list of co-sponsors for the bill that created the disparate sentencing and the list of the members ultimately who were part of the Black Caucus?
Have I seen that list? No.
Of the co-sponsors of that bill?
No.
Then I would suggest the gentleman might be surprised, but it's who's who.
Well,
and Charlie Rangel was recognized by President Reagan as being major leader and mover and shaker in helping that come about. But I appreciate the gentleman yielding.
Yes. Well, I'll check that out. But it was not a Congressional Black Caucus position, I can assure you. Well, that's the thrust of my feelings about the importance of this hearing and this markup. And I'm pleased that you gave me this time, Chairman Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our first witness is Congressman Steve Cohen. Representative Cohen will testify about H.R. 1412, the Justice Integrity Act of 2009, legislation which he introduced to address the racial disparities in the federal criminal justice system. Chairman Cohen chairs the Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Commercial and Administrative Law and also sits on the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties Subcommittee. He is also a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Congressman Cohen.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gomert, and Chairman Conyers, and all the fellow members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this hearing today and for inviting me to testify. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this crucial discussion on the real and perceived racial disparities that permeate the criminal justice system. Today, I would like to bring to the subcommittee's attention a bill I have introduced that would further this discussion. Studies, reports, and case law from the last several years have documented racial disparities at many stages of the criminal justice system. This includes racial profiling of potential suspects, prosecutorial discretion over charging and plea bargaining decisions, mandatory minimum sentences, countless other policies and decisions that may contribute to the disparities that we may see today. Even laws that are race neutral on their face may lead to racially disparate outcomes. Our cocaine sentencing laws are one obvious example of this, and I commend Chairman Scott for his leadership in finally getting this issue properly addressed. The cannabis laws in this country are also similar, and they affect both African Americans and Hispanics in a greatly disproportionate way. And my hometown of Memphis and the city of Virginia Beach are two cities where you see a great increase in arrests of African Americans for cannabis over non-African Americans. In addition, racial disparities are often the consequence of unconscious bias on the part of police, prosecutors, and others involved in the criminal justice system. That makes them no less real. Just like institutional racism exists in our country, it is racism whether it is there by tradition or not. It is important that we understand the extent of these racial disparities, the causes, and most important, the solutions. We also need to determine whether our perception of these disparities is greater than the actual problem. That is why I introduced H.R. 1412, the Justice Integrity Act. This legislation would establish a pilot program to study the real and perceived racial and ethnic disparities in federal law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and make recommendations to address any disparities or perceptions of bias that are found as a result of this study. One of our witnesses today on another panel is going to say there is no deliberate racial discrimination or disparities. I would disagree with that decision or that thought, but regardless if it's not deliberate, if it exists, it's still wrong. And if there's perception, it's wrong too. The Justice Integrity Act would establish a 5-year pilot program to create an advisory group in 10 United States judicial districts headed by the U.S. Attorney for those districts. The advisory groups would consist of federal and state prosecutors, public defenders, private defense counsel, judges, correctional officers, victims' rights representatives, civil rights organizations, business reps, and faith-based organizations. The gamut. The advisory groups would be responsible for gathering data on the presence, cause, and extent of racial and ethnic disparities at each stage of the criminal justice system. Each advisory group would then recommend a plan specific to each district to ensure progress toward racial and ethnic equality. The U.S. Attorney would consider the recommendations of the group, adopt a plan, and submit a report to the Attorney General. The bill would require the Attorney General then to submit a comprehensive report to Congress at the end of the pilot program, outlining the results of all 10 districts and recommending best practices. I'd like to emphasize two of the bill's most important elements. First, it envisions an inclusive process that brings together all of the relevant stakeholders, both sides of the bar, all people involved. Second, by establishing advisory groups throughout the country, it recognizes different communities may face different problems and require different solutions, just as Justice Brandeis talked about the beauty of laboratories of democracy in different states. You get a representative sample of the nation. I'm pleased to be joined in this legislation by Chairman Conyers and nearly 30 other co-sponsors, including several members of the subcommittee and the full Judiciary Committee. Companion legislation has been introduced in the Senate by Senators Cardin and Specter. I would note the original Senate sponsor was the distinguished Vice President, the Honorable Joe Biden. The bill has also been endorsed by numerous organizations, including the American Bar Association, the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Brennan Center for Justice, the Sentencing Project, among others. Racial disparities have engendered a crisis of public trust in the integrity of the criminal justice system and fueled community perception of bias. When the system is perceived to be unfair towards racial minorities, communities can become reluctant to report crimes or cooperate with law enforcement and prosecutors. This reluctance to work with law enforcement can make it more difficult to catch criminals and protect the very people who distrust the justice system, thereby perpetuating a mistrust of the system. We must do what we can to end this cycle of mistrust. The first step is to understand the full scope of the problem we're facing. This hearing is critical to that endeavor. I believe the Justice Integrity Act would expand upon today's important hearing. It would also undertake a systematic process to bring together all the stakeholders and develop concrete solutions. It would help restore public confidence in the criminal justice system and ensure the fair and equitable treatment of all Americans. I understand that the Deputy Attorney General is currently leading a task force to examine many of these same issues we're talking about today, and I applaud Attorney General Holder and the President for their commitment to criminal justice issues. I think the Justice Integrity Act is a perfect complement to these efforts, and I'd welcome the input of the administration and members of the committee as we move forward. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your holding this hearing today, giving me the opportunity to testify. As Mr. Conyers mentioned, I have 24 years experience as a state senator working on criminal justice issues on the Judiciary Committee in Tennessee and was a criminal defense attorney. All you have to do is go to my city in Memphis, Tennessee at 201 Poplar, the Criminal Justice Center, and you can't help but see that there is racial disparities. Whether intentional or unintentional, they exist. And the system has perpetuated it, and it is just as much a failing in this country's efforts to get a more perfect union as any problem we have today. The healthcare system is a problem. The criminal justice system is a sin. I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses in the next panel, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? No questions. We appreciate your testimony today.
Unless he wants us to ask him questions.
We'll ask our next panel